For over 100 years, two of the ancient world's greatest powers fought a war that could only end with the complete destruction of one of them. On one side stood Rome, a rising Italian city-state with the most disciplined army in the Mediterranean. On the other stood Carthage, a wealthy Phoenician trading empire that had dominated the western seas for centuries. They fought 3 wars across 3 generations, and when it was finally over, one civilization had been erased from the map so thoroughly that scholars would argue for millennia about what it had even looked like. This was the Punic Wars, the ultimate grudge match of the ancient world. So sit back, grab a cup of tea, and get ready to follow the century-long struggle from its first clash over Sicily to Hannibal's legendary march across the Alps, and finally to the day when Roman soldiers set fire to Carthage and declared that a great city would never rise there again. The word Punic comes from the Latin Punicus, which was simply the Roman word for Phoenician. The Carthaginians were descendants of Phoenician colonists from the city of Tyre, in what is now Lebanon. According to legend, Carthage was founded in 814 BCE by Queen Dido, who fled Tyre after the murder of her husband. She supposedly purchased land from a local king, as much as could be covered by an ox hide, then cleverly cut the hide into thin strips and enclosed enough ground to build a citadel. Whether the story is true or not, it captures something essential about the Carthaginians. They were traders, negotiators, people who solved problems with cleverness, rather than brute force. By the time Rome began its rise to power, Carthage had become the dominant force in the western Mediterranean. The city controlled the North African coast from modern Libya to Morocco, held colonies in Spain, ruled Sardinia, Corsica, and the western half of Sicily, and maintained trading posts throughout the region. Carthage was fabulously wealthy, its harbour filled with ships from every corner of the known world, its warehouses stocked with goods from Africa, Spain, and beyond. Rome, in contrast, was a relative newcomer to Mediterranean affairs. For centuries, the Romans had been focused on conquering the Italian peninsula, subduing their neighbours one tribe at a time. They had developed the most effective infantry force in the ancient world, disciplined legions that could march all day and fight at the end of it. But they were fundamentally a land power. Their experience with naval warfare was limited, and their ambitions had never extended much beyond Italy's shores. The two powers had coexisted peacefully for centuries, bound by treaties that recognized their separate spheres of influence. Rome controlled Italy, Carthage dominated the western Mediterranean sea lanes. As long as neither threatened the other's core interests, there was no reason to fight. But in 264 BCE, their interests collided in Sicily, and a conflict began that would shape the ancient world. Sicily was the largest and richest island in the Mediterranean, and in 264 BCE it was divided between 3 powers. The eastern third, including the great city of Syracuse, was Greek. The western portion was Carthaginian, and in the northeast a band of Italian mercenaries called the Mamertines had seized the city of Messana and were causing trouble for everyone. The Mamertines were warriors from Campania in southern Italy, who had originally been hired by Syracuse. When their contract ended, they had seized Messana, rather than returning home, setting themselves up as independent raiders. They attacked Greek and Carthaginian territory alike, making themselves a nuisance that someone would eventually have to address. When Syracuse decided to eliminate the Mamertine problem, the mercenaries panicked and appealed for help to both Carthage and Rome. The Carthaginians arrived first, establishing a garrison in Messana. But the Mamertines, perhaps realizing that Carthaginian protection might become permanent occupation, then appealed to Rome. The Roman Senate was divided. Some senators argued that Rome should stay out of Sicilian affairs. This was Carthage's sphere of influence, and war with Carthage would be a massive undertaking. Others pointed out that if Carthage controlled all of Sicily, they would dominate the straits between Italy and the island, potentially threatening Rome's southern coast. The Senate deadlocked, and the decision was passed to the popular assembly. The people voted for war. Thus began the First Punic War, almost by accident, a conflict that neither side had particularly wanted, but that neither could back down from. It would last for 23 years, cost hundreds of thousands of lives, and fundamentally transform both powers. The early stages of the war went well for Rome on land. Roman legions crossed into Sicily and quickly established themselves as the dominant military force on the island. They defeated Carthaginian and Syracusan forces in a series of engagements, eventually convincing Syracuse to switch sides and become a Roman ally. But the Carthaginians still controlled the seas, and without naval power, Rome could not force a decisive conclusion. Here we encounter one of the most remarkable military adaptations in ancient history. Rome, a landlocked Italian city with virtually no naval tradition, decided to build a fleet from scratch and challenge Carthage, the greatest naval power in the Mediterranean, on her own element. According to ancient sources, the Romans used a captured Carthaginian warship as a model and built 120 quinqueremes in just 60 days. These were large warships with 5 banks of oars, each requiring around 300 rowers and carrying a complement of marines. Even if the 60-day timeline is exaggerated, the scale of the Roman shipbuilding program was extraordinary. But building ships was one thing, knowing how to use them was another. The Romans were infantry soldiers, not sailors. Carthaginian crews had generations of experience maneuvering their ships in naval combat, ramming enemy vessels at precisely the right angle, backing off before the enemy could respond. Roman rowers were learning as they went. The Romans solved this problem with characteristic practicality. If they couldn't beat the Carthaginians at sailing, they would turn naval battles into land battles. They invented a device called the corvus, Latin for raven, a boarding bridge mounted on the bow of each warship. When a Roman ship came alongside an enemy vessel, the corvus would drop, its heavy iron spike punching into the enemy deck and locking the two ships together. Roman marines could then swarm across and fight hand-to-hand, where their infantry training gave them a decisive advantage. The corvus made its debut at the Battle of Mylae in 260 BCE, and the results were devastating. The Carthaginian fleet, confident in their traditional superiority, found themselves unable to escape once the Roman boarding bridges dropped. The Romans captured or sank 50 Carthaginian ships and killed thousands of sailors. It was the first major Roman naval victory in history. The Romans followed this success with an even larger victory at the Battle of Ecnomus in 256 BCE. This was one of the largest naval battles in ancient history, involving perhaps 350 ships on each side. Again, the corvus proved decisive, and the Romans destroyed or captured over 100 Carthaginian vessels. The sea was now open for the Romans to carry the war to Africa itself. An expeditionary force under the consul Marcus Atilius Regulus landed near Carthage and began ravaging the countryside. Carthage seemed on the verge of collapse, and the city sued for peace. But Regulus, overconfident and perhaps hoping for personal glory, demanded terms so harsh that the Carthaginians decided to keep fighting. This proved to be a catastrophic mistake. Carthage hired a Spartan mercenary named Xanthippus, who reorganized their army and employed their war elephants to maximum effect. At the Battle of Tunis in 255 BCE, Xanthippus destroyed the Roman army. Regulus was captured, and only 2,000 Romans escaped back to their ships. The African expedition had ended in disaster. What followed was a grinding war of attrition in Sicily. Rome and Carthage fought battle after battle, siege after siege, neither able to land a knockout blow. The Romans suffered a series of catastrophic naval losses, not primarily from Carthaginian attacks, but from storms that destroyed entire fleets. In 255 BCE, a storm sank most of the fleet returning from Africa, drowning perhaps 100,000 men. In 253 BCE, another storm claimed 150 ships. In 249 BCE, the consul Publius Claudius Pulcher led his fleet to disaster at the Battle of Drepana, Rome's worst naval defeat of the war. By the late 200s, 40s BCE, both sides were exhausted. The war had lasted over 2 decades, consumed vast resources and killed enormous numbers of men. But it was Carthage that broke first. The Romans, through a remarkable effort of private funding, built one final fleet. At the Battle of the Aegates Islands in 241 BCE, this fleet destroyed the Carthaginian navy, cutting off the Carthaginian garrisons in Sicily from reinforcement. Carthage accepted peace terms, They evacuated Sicily entirely, paid a massive indemnity to Rome, and agreed not to attack Syracuse. The First Punic War was over, and Rome had won. But victory came at an almost unbearable cost. Ancient sources claim that Rome lost over 700 ships during the war, many to storms rather than enemy action. The human toll was staggering. Perhaps 300,000 Romans and Italians died, along with an even larger number of Carthaginians and their allies. Sicily had been devastated by more than 2 decades of fighting, and the peace would prove to be merely an armistice. The aftermath of the First Punic War was nearly as destructive for Carthage as the war itself. The city had hired thousands of mercenaries from across the Mediterranean, Libyans, Iberians, Celts, Greeks and others, promising them pay that now, with the treasury empty and the fleet destroyed, could not be delivered. The mercenaries revolted. What followed was a savage conflict known as the Mercenary War or the Truceless War, lasting from 241 to 237 BCE. Both sides committed atrocities. Prisoners were tortured and killed. Entire populations were massacred. Carthage very nearly destroyed itself in this internal conflict. While Carthage was distracted by the Mercenary War, Rome seized the opportunity to take Sardinia and Corsica, islands that had been Carthaginian for centuries, but whose garrisons had joined the mercenary revolt. When Carthage protested, Rome threatened renewed war. Carthage, still reeling from the mercenary conflict, could not resist. They paid an additional indemnity and watched Rome annex more of their territory. This was perhaps the moment when the Second War became inevitable. Many Carthaginians felt that Rome had betrayed the peace settlement, taking advantage of Carthaginian weakness to grab territory that was not included in the original treaty. Among those who felt this most keenly was Hamilcar Barca, the general who had fought Rome to a standstill in Sicily and who had saved Carthage from the mercenaries. Hamilcar turned his attention to Spain, where Carthage still had ancient colonies and where silver mines could refill the emptied treasury. He spent the last years of his life conquering much of the Iberian Peninsula, building a power base that was almost a personal empire. According to legend, before he departed for Spain, Hamilcar made his young son swear eternal hatred of Rome on an altar to the gods. That son was Hannibal Barca, and he would keep his oath. When Hamilcar died in 229 BCE, command passed first to his son-in-law Hasdrubal, and then in 221 BCE to Hannibal himself. By this time, Hannibal was 25 years old and had spent most of his life with the Carthaginian army in Spain. He was brilliant, charismatic, and absolutely dedicated to one goal, the destruction of Rome. Rome watched the growth of Carthaginian power in Spain with increasing alarm. The two powers negotiated a treaty setting the Ebro River as the northern limit of Carthaginian expansion, but tensions continued to rise. In 219 BCE, Hannibal attacked the Spanish city of Saguntum, which had an alliance with Rome. The siege lasted 8 months, and when Saguntum fell, Rome sent an embassy to Carthage demanding Hannibal's surrender. The Carthaginian Senate refused. One of the Roman envoys gathered the folds of his toga and declared that he carried peace and war within them. Carthage could choose. The Carthaginians chose war. The Second Punic War had begun. What followed was one of the most extraordinary military campaigns in history. Hannibal knew that Carthage could not match Rome's manpower. Rome could call upon the resources of all Italy, while Carthage's North African territories were distant from the theatre of war. He knew that Carthage had lost control of the sea, making reinforcement by water almost impossible, and he knew that Rome's Italian allies were the foundation of Roman power. If those allies could be detached from Rome, the Roman system would collapse. Hannibal's solution was audacious beyond belief. He would take the war to Italy itself, crossing overland through Spain, Gaul, and the Alps to strike at Rome's heartland. No one expected such a move. The Romans were preparing to fight in Spain and Africa. They never imagined that a Carthaginian army would appear in northern Italy. In the spring of 218 BCE, Hannibal marched from Spain with approximately 50,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants. He crossed the Pyrenees, fought his way through hostile Gallic tribes in southern France, and in late autumn began the crossing of the Alps. The Alpine crossing has become legendary, and deservedly so. Hannibal's army climbed passes over 10,000 feet high, in conditions of snow and ice, harassed by hostile mountain tribes, losing men and animals to falls, cold, and starvation. The ancient sources describe soldiers hacking paths through ice, elephants slipping on frozen slopes, and rockfalls triggered by enemy attacks. By the time the army descended into Italy, Hannibal had lost perhaps half his force, but he had achieved the impossible. A Carthaginian army stood on Italian soil. The Romans scrambled to respond. They sent a consular army north to intercept Hannibal, and in December 218 BCE, the two forces met at the Battle of the Trebia. It was a disaster for Rome. Hannibal's cavalry outflanked the Roman infantry while a hidden force emerged to attack them from behind. Perhaps 20,000 Romans were killed or captured. The remainder fled. The following spring, Hannibal struck again. He marched through the swamps of the Arno Valley, a route so difficult that he lost an eye to infection during the passage, and emerged in central Italy. A Roman army under the consul Gaius Flaminius pursued him, and at Lake Trasimene in June 217 BCE, Hannibal sprung a devastating ambush. The Roman army, strung out along a narrow lakeside road, was attacked from all sides simultaneously. Flaminius was killed, and 15,000 Roman soldiers died in a few hours. It was the largest ambush in military history. Rome was in panic. For the first time, the city appointed a dictator, a constitutional office reserved for emergencies, and gave total power to Quintus Fabius Maximus. Fabius understood that he could not defeat Hannibal in open battle. Instead, he adopted a strategy of delay and attrition, shadowing Hannibal's army but refusing pitched battle, harrying his foragers, cutting off stragglers, waiting for the Carthaginian force to wear itself out. This strategy earned Fabius the nickname Cunctator, the delayer, and it was not popular. The Romans wanted vengeance, not caution. When Fabius's term as dictator ended, command passed to the consuls Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus, who marched south with the largest Roman army ever assembled, perhaps 80,000 men. They found Hannibal at Cannae, in Apulia, on the 2nd of August, 216 BCE. What happened there was the worst military disaster in Roman history. Hannibal deployed his army with a deliberately weak centre, Celtic and Spanish infantry, who slowly gave ground as the Roman legions pressed forward. On the flanks, his cavalry quickly defeated the Roman horsemen and then swept around behind the Roman infantry. Meanwhile, the African infantry on either end of the Carthaginian line swung inward, attacking the Roman flanks. The Romans found themselves surrounded on all sides, packed so tightly that they could barely lift their weapons. The slaughter lasted for hours. When it ended, somewhere between 50,000 and 70,000 Roman soldiers lay dead on the field, more than America lost in the entire Vietnam War, killed in a single afternoon. Both consuls were casualties. Paulus was killed, and Varro barely escaped. It was the greatest battlefield defeat in Roman history, and one of the deadliest battles ever fought. In any normal war, Cannae would have ended things. Any other nation would have surrendered. Hannibal sent envoys to Rome offering peace terms. The Senate refused even to receive them. According to legend, when the Senate learned the full scope of the disaster, they passed a resolution forbidding women to weep in public, because mourning was everywhere and the sound of grief was demoralizing the city. Rome's resilience after Cannae is one of the remarkable facts of ancient history. Instead of surrendering, the city doubled down. They freed slaves to serve in the legions. They recruited boys too young for military service. They melted down temple decorations to pay for weapons. They executed men who spoke of peace. And they went back on the offensive. It took years, more than a decade, but gradually Rome recovered. Fabius's strategy of delay was adopted more broadly, and Roman commanders avoided pitched battle with Hannibal while attacking his allies and cutting off his reinforcements. Some Italian cities had defected to Hannibal after Cannae, but one by one Rome reconquered them. When Capua, the second largest city in Italy, was recaptured, the Romans executed the leading citizens and sold the population into slavery as a warning to others. Meanwhile, the war spread across the Mediterranean. Rome fought Carthaginian forces in Spain, gradually wearing them down. They allied with Greek enemies of Macedonia, which had signed a treaty with Hannibal, and they found their own military genius, Publius Cornelius Scipio, known to history as Scipio Africanus. Scipio was only 25 when he was given command of the Roman forces in Spain, after his father and uncle had been killed, fighting the Carthaginians there. In a brilliant campaign from 210 to 206 BCE, he conquered all of Carthaginian Spain, capturing the great city of New Carthage in a surprise assault and defeating the Carthaginian armies in a series of battles. He was a new kind of Roman general, charismatic, tactically innovative, willing to take risks, and he had a strategic vision for ending the war. In 204 BCE, Scipio invaded Africa. The Carthaginian Senate recalled Hannibal from Italy to defend the homeland, the first time in 15 years that Hannibal had left Italian soil. At the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE, Scipio and Hannibal met for the first and only time. Scipio neutralized Hannibal's elephants by opening lanes in his formation for them to pass through harmlessly. His cavalry, strengthened by a crucial alliance with the Numidian king Massinissa, swept away the Carthaginian horsemen and then returned to attack Hannibal's infantry from behind. It was Cannae in reverse. Hannibal's army was destroyed, and Carthage was forced to accept peace. The terms were harsh. Carthage surrendered all its territory outside Africa, gave up its entire navy except for 10 ships, paid an enormous indemnity of 10,000 talents spread over 50 years, and agreed never to make war without Roman permission. The Second Punic War was over, and Rome had won, but Carthage still existed. For the next 50 years, Carthage slowly rebuilt. The city's commercial genius had not been destroyed, and despite the massive indemnity payments, Carthage became wealthy again. This was observed with alarm by certain factions in Rome, particularly by Marcus Porcius Cato, known as Cato the Elder. Cato was a conservative Roman senator who had fought in the Second Punic War and never forgot his hatred of Carthage. According to Plutarch, he visited Carthage on a diplomatic mission and was disturbed to find the city prosperous and thriving. From then on, he ended every speech in the Senate, regardless of the topic, with the phrase "Ceterum censeo Carthaginem esse delendam." Furthermore, I consider that Carthage must be destroyed. Cato's obsession may seem paranoid, but there was a strategic logic behind it. As long as Carthage existed, it represented a potential rival. Even without its empire, Carthage was wealthy, strategically located, and capable of rebuilding its military power. The memory of Hannibal crossing the Alps was still fresh. No Roman wanted to risk another invasion of Italy. The opportunity for war came in 150 BCE. Numidia, Rome's ally in North Africa, had been steadily encroaching on Carthaginian territory for decades. Carthage appealed repeatedly to Rome for justice, but Rome consistently sided with Numidia. Finally, in 150 BCE, Carthage raised an army to defend itself against Numidian aggression, violating the treaty that required Roman permission for any military action. Rome declared war. The Third Punic War had begun, and its purpose was not conquest, but annihilation. The Romans sent an army to Africa and delivered an ultimatum. Carthage must surrender all weapons and disarm completely. The Carthaginians, hoping to avoid destruction, complied. They handed over 200,000 sets of armor, 2,000 catapults, and vast quantities of javelins, arrows, and other weapons. Then the Romans delivered their final demand. Carthage must be abandoned. The population must relocate at least 10 miles from the sea. The city would be destroyed. At this, the Carthaginians finally resisted. They had nothing left to lose. They closed the city gates, freed their slaves, and began manufacturing weapons from every scrap of metal they could find. According to ancient sources, women cut their hair to make bowstrings. The Carthaginians had been disarmed, but they refused to die without a fight. The siege lasted 3 years. The Carthaginians defended their walls with desperate courage, repelling Roman assaults and launching counterattacks. The Romans struggled to make progress, and a series of commanders failed to take the city. Finally, In 147 BCE, command was given to Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of Scipio Africanus, who tightened the blockade and prepared for a final assault. In the spring of 146 BCE, Scipio's forces breached the walls and fought their way into the city. The battle raged, street by street, house by house, for 6 days. The Carthaginians fought from the rooftops, forcing the Romans to advance through a maze of burning buildings. When the fighting finally ended, the city was a smoking ruin. 50,000 survivors, all that remained of a population that may have numbered 700,000, were sold into slavery. The ruins were formally cursed, and the territory became the Roman province of Africa. Ancient sources claim that the Romans ploughed salt into the earth to ensure that nothing would ever grow there again, though modern historians doubt this. Salt was expensive, and the symbolic gesture would have required vast quantities. Whether or not the earth was literally salted, the destruction was complete. Carthage, which had dominated the western Mediterranean for centuries, was gone. Its libraries were destroyed. Its history was written by its enemies. Even its language eventually died. What we know of Carthage comes almost entirely from Greek and Roman sources, the victor's perspective on a vanished civilization. The Punic Wars transformed Rome from an Italian regional power into the dominant force in the Mediterranean world. In 264 BCE, Rome's influence barely extended beyond the Italian peninsula. By 146 BCE, the year Carthage fell, Rome controlled Spain, North Africa, Greece, and much of the Near East. The wars had forced Rome to develop new capabilities: a powerful navy, the administrative systems to govern distant provinces, the military capacity to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously. But the wars also changed Rome internally. The long struggle against Carthage created a generation of professional soldiers and ambitious generals, men like Scipio Africanus, who became more powerful than the traditional institutions of the Republic could contain. The massive influx of slaves from the conquered territories disrupted the Italian economy, displacing free farmers and concentrating wealth in the hands of the elite. The habits of total war, the willingness to destroy entire populations, to fight until the enemy was annihilated, would characterize Roman expansion for centuries to come. The complete destruction of Carthage sent a message to the entire Mediterranean world. Rome would accept nothing less than absolute dominance. There would be no balance of power, no coexistence with rival empires. Submit to Rome or face annihilation. That message was heard and understood from Spain to Syria, and it shaped the political calculations of every state that dealt with Rome for generations. What should we make of the Punic Wars from our distance of more than 2,000 years? They stand as a case study in the dynamics of great power rivalry. Two states rose to dominance in their respective spheres. Their interests collided, and neither could accept the existence of the other. The wars escalated from territorial disputes to existential struggle, from limited conflict to total war. In the end, one civilization was erased, and the other went on to build an empire that lasted 500 years. The cost was staggering. Hundreds of thousands died in battles, sieges, and massacres. Populations were enslaved or exterminated. Cultures and languages were destroyed. The wealth of the Mediterranean was devastated and redistributed. And yet Rome remembered the Punic Wars as a triumph, the foundation of their greatness, proof that Roman virtue and Roman resilience could overcome any enemy. Hannibal, the great Carthaginian general who terrorized Italy for 15 years, became a legendary figure even to his enemies. The Romans studied his campaigns for centuries, learning from his tactics even as they condemned his cause. He died in exile around 183 BCE, taking poison rather than surrender to the Romans who had pursued him across the Mediterranean. "Let us relieve the Romans of their anxiety," he supposedly said before drinking. "They find it too long to wait for an old man's death." The destruction of Carthage left Rome without serious rivals in the western Mediterranean. Within a century, Rome would conquer the eastern Mediterranean as well, bringing the entire ancient world under its control. The Republic would eventually tear itself apart in civil wars. The same competitive military aristocracy that had defeated Carthage would turn on itself. But what emerged from that chaos was the Roman Empire, the most powerful state the ancient world had ever seen. And on the ruins of Carthage, Rome eventually built a new city, a Roman colony that became one of the great cities of the empire. The curse was lifted, or perhaps forgotten, and Carthage rose again under Roman rule. It was never Punic again, never the heart of an independent civilization, but it endured for centuries as a Roman city until it was destroyed again by the Arabs in the 7th century CE. Today, little remains of the Carthage that fought Rome. The harbour is silted in, the buildings are rubble, the language is dead. We have a few inscriptions, a handful of artefacts, the biased accounts of Greek and Roman writers. The Carthaginians left no great literature that survived, no historical accounts in their own words. Their story is told by their destroyers. But we can still trace the outlines of what happened. We can still walk the battlefields of Cannae and Zama, still see the ruins where the sieges took place. We can read Polybius and Livy and try to imagine what it was like to face the Roman legions, or to watch Hannibal's elephants emerge from the Alpine snows. And we can reflect on what these wars meant, the price of empire, the cost of rivalry, the terrible logic that turns competition into annihilation. The Punic Wars are a reminder that civilizations are not permanent. They rise and fall, they destroy, and are destroyed. Carthage was old and wealthy and powerful, the heart of a trading empire that spanned the western Mediterranean. Rome was young and hungry and ruthless, willing to sacrifice anything for victory. One of them had to lose, and the loser left almost no trace behind. So the next time you think about the great empires of the ancient world, spare a thought for Carthage, for the civilization that nearly conquered Rome, that produced one of history's greatest generals, that fought for over a century before it was finally erased from the earth. They were not monsters or villains, they were simply the losers, and history is written by the winners. What we know of them is filtered through the words of their enemies, and what we have lost is immeasurable. The wars are over. Carthage is gone. And Rome, eternal Rome, lived on to build an empire that shaped the world we live in today. That is the legacy of the Punic Wars, more than a century of conflict that determined which civilization would dominate the ancient world, and which would be remembered only in fragments, ruins, and the words of those who destroyed it.